So I wanted to do a bit of a thought experiment here regarding the effect of a universal basic income on the RC industry and on RC racing in general. I was inspired to make a video about this because in the most recent election cycle, the 2020 presidential election cycle, there is a candidate running for president who is proposing a universal basic income of $1,000 per month for every American adult. And, I don't want to get political here because I know that, there are plenty of RC racers who are, conservative, and there are plenty of others who are liberal. So I'm not trying to stoke any, conflict there. I'm just trying to go through a thought experiment on what it would actually mean if everybody had $1,000 a month extra in additional income above and beyond what they already make at their job, and how that would affect their racing. And for me personally, it wouldn't make a huge difference because, I'm a PhD in engineering. I make a pretty decent salary. I can afford to buy, however many race cars I want. And if you go through my video history, you'll see plenty of rather expensive, builds and restorations that I do. So it doesn't affect me, but there are a lot of people in the RC community who are not PhD level engineers. They just have everyday jobs, and that's perfectly fine. But it doesn't afford them as much capital to invest in, racing a lot of cars, racing high quality, expensive cars without making other sacrifices in their lives. So, and I've even seen cases where, some of my friends who I used to go racing with, their income was so irregular that if they ran into like a health crisis, if they had to go to the hospital or something like that, and all of a sudden they have this bill that they can't pay for because they don't have enough in savings, then they have to sell one of their cars, and just to raise money, and so that impacts their ability to go racing, at least in the short term. And some people like that, when they have to resort to that kind of a measure, they end up selling their more valuable cars, which are usually their vintage cars. Like these here, for instance, are vintage cars that actually aren't made anymore. They're from the 1990s, and these are worth more money than a modern RC car because they're out of production, and so they're kind of collector's items. So having to sell these when you put so much love and care into them, just because you had to go to the hospital, like, it's kind of unfair, right? So what if we all had $1,000 a month extra? What would it mean? Well, let's go to my whiteboard and let's do a little bit of math and let's see what it would mean. So there are a lot of ways that you could approach this, and from what I think is a good way to start approaching this question from is just the typical, say, week-to-week racing budget for a typical racer, okay? So someone like me, when I used to go racing, I don't anymore as much because I have diaper duties to deal with, but I would take, on a typical weekend, pretty much, actually I would take a lot of my cars, but I'd actually end up racing maybe 3 of them on a given weekend. And then in trophy races, I would do 4 or 5, because in trophy races you have greater attendance, and so the chance of a particular class being available is higher. Okay, so I would want to average maybe running 4 classes a week throughout a given month. So for those who aren't too familiar with the concept of racing class, what I mean by a racing class is a different classification of vehicle. So for example, this here would be a stadium truck, and this would be a 4-wheel drive buggy. So these are 2 different classifications of vehicle. On a typical trophy race, you'd run maybe 4-wheel drive modified buggy, modified stadium truck, and then you might have like a 2-wheel drive buggy. This is the 2-wheel drive buggy here. So you could do 2-wheel drive stock and mod. So that's 4 classes, and then in addition to that, you could run like a bonus 5th class, so maybe 4-wheel drive short course truck or something like that. So you basically bring everything, and then you see what other people have, and then based on what everyone else is running, you kind of figure out what classes you can run. So anyway, let's suppose you run, 4 classes a week. What would that mean in terms of cost? Okay, so the cost tends to vary from track to track, but roughly you're looking at a cost structure that's in this ballpark here. Okay, so if I ran 4 classes, and if I assume the worst case cost structure, I would end up paying 35 plus 15, that's 50, plus 2 times 10, that's $70 a week. Worst case. Okay, and then on top of that's just for registration. Okay, on top of that, you have other additional costs to racing, such as the tires. Tires are very difficult to pin down in terms of, say, an average cost that people would pay, because it depends heavily on the type of surface that you race on. So if you race on a very high grip surface like AstroTurf, grip means friction, friction means tire wear. So that results in you burning through more sets of tires on a given weekend than you would if you were running on low grip dirt. So certain tracks, you can buy one set of tires and it'll last you an entire racing season. Other tracks, because of the type of surface you run on, you may go through multiple sets of tires in a given day. So I'm kind of taking a middle ground here and assuming that you can buy a set of tires for one particular chassis, and that would last you a month. Okay, so that would last you 4 weekends of racing for one set of tires. Some dirt tracks, do enable that. So if you're running 4 classes, you got to get 4 sets of tires and wheels. And that if you buy that all directly from the hobby shop, which tends to cost a bit more than buying it online with coupon codes, that could cost you on the order of $240 a month, so about $60 a week. Also, another component of racing is spare parts and upgrades. You are going to break things from time to time. You got to buy spare parts, typically from the shop. If you break something in one round of qualifying and you have to get a spare part right away, you get it from the shop. Again, that usually comes at a premium. But the shop has to make money, so that's what you got to do. Upgrades are also a big part of racing because as you're trying to figure out how to make your car faster and more competitive, above and beyond what you could do with the actual setup of the car itself, you may find you want a lighter component here or a stronger component there, and so you buy upgrades. Upgrades, again, it varies a lot with the driver and the type of track you're racing on, but let's budget something in that's, say, something more on the higher cost estimate side, about $200 a month for upgrades. Okay, and then you have your we'll call them human needs costs. So you got to eat food while you're at the track, and a full race program could run you most of the day. So you're looking at maybe 2 meals for the day, about $30, $15 a meal, something like that. And then you have gas and tolls. Not everybody lives in direct proximity to a racing track. You might have to drive an hour or so. Most of the places I used to race at were at least an hour away. So you're paying for gas. Sometimes, depending on where you go, if you have to cross a bridge or go on the thruway, you're paying for tolls. So you might end up paying about $40 a week or so in transportation costs just to get to the track and to get back home. Okay, so a pessimistic estimate of what it would cost to run 4 classes a week every week would be about $250 a week, which comes out to $1,000 a month. Okay, great. But of course, this $1,000 a month doesn't translate directly to a universal basic income of $1,000 a month, because this has to be paid for, right? And there are various proposals of how to pay for this. And it basically comes from a 10% value-added tax being a big component of that. And then there are other things like cost savings downstream, which are more related to policy, and you can get into those details if you want. But all of these things combined can pay for $1,000 a month. But what that effectively means is, in this limited view, if you're paying a 10% value-added tax, which is basically like a sales tax, your effective purchasing power isn't really $1,000 a month. It's more like $900 a month in, let's call them today's dollars, right? And then on top of that, this number will drop a bit more still, because you're changing the distribution of income throughout the income level, right? So if I were to draw a distribution plot of, it'd be like a histogram. So you'd have, on the y-axis would be like the count or the population, and in the x-axis would be the income level, right? You might have something that looks like a Gaussian curve like this, okay? And in the United States, the median income is somewhere around $50,000 per year, give or take a bit. If we add on top of that $1,000 a month, which comes to $12,000 a year, you're taking this whole curve and just lifting it up. But on a percent-wise basis, the percent increase in income at the lower level is much higher than the percent increase in income at the higher level. Okay, so it kind of distorts the percent-wise distribution of income, for lack of a better term. So this will have some impact on pricing for various objects, because you're going to have some people buying more stuff because they have more money and they need to buy more stuff. So demand goes up, prices go up a bit as a result of that. It's just natural, market economics. So that part I'm not really pricing in here. So maybe we can ballpark it and say, okay, this $900 a month would drop to, let's say $700 a month, roughly speaking, in today's dollars. Okay, so if after getting this $1,000 a month UBI, your actual purchasing power is about $700 a month, then it can mostly cover the $1,000 a month that you would spend on racing toy cars every weekend. Okay, and then if you run only 2 classes instead of 4 classes, you're coming out to about $560 a month, which a $700 a month, effective purchasing power would easily cover, right? And you would more than cover that, because you'd have a bit of margin, a bit of residual income, beyond that. So what's interesting here is that, assuming you're not using this for your actual basic human needs, you can use this to fund relatively easily most or all of your racing budget on a week-to-week basis. And for someone who has a fair amount of experience racing RC cars, I've been doing it for several years, you find that the initial investment is actually a smaller investment. So for example, if I wanted to, buy one of these cars, let's say these were in production, a brand new kit might cost maybe $400, and that's with no electronics, no tires, no motor, no battery, nothing. And then I have to get all of that stuff, and then I have to get tools, I have to get battery chargers, I have to get, all the equipment that's necessary to do it. So the upfront investment in something like this could be over $1,000, but that's a one-time investment. When you go racing every weekend, you're spending that money every single weekend. So over time, you end up spending a lot more money on your racing costs than you do on the actual investment in the car itself. Okay, so this becomes a much smaller fraction of your total expenditure. So that's why I'm looking at this more from the angle of the actual racing budget, okay? Because this, over time, will be the dominant factor. But what ends up happening is, this will, of course, give you more disposable income to spend on other parts of the hobby. So, for example, you can buy more kits. So people who might presently only run one class because they can only afford to run, say, just, stock buggy, maybe they buy a stadium truck. Maybe they buy a four-wheel drive buggies. Now they have extra money to do so. Maybe they buy higher quality kits, right? There are different manufacturers for these cars. Some of them, frankly, make much better quality kits than other manufacturers, and of course they cost more as a result. So you may find the distribution of demand shifting toward higher quality kits, and that could force the manufacturers of, let's call them, cheaper and lower quality kits to improve their game. So you'll see a change in market demand for different types of kits, which would be interesting. You might also see more people go racing, because people like me, who I haven't been racing heavily for a while because I have a toddler son and I got to take care of him. And with or without the money, I still have that priority. But some people might be inclined to hire a babysitter to watch over the kid while they go racing. Okay, fine. You have a little extra money to do that. You'd also end up very likely purchasing more things directly from the hobby shop. So when you go racing, you go to a track, and that track, 99% of the time, is run by a hobby shop. The hobby shop makes money not from the track. They make money from selling kits and selling parts from the shop. And then the track ends up costing the shop money. So in order to subsidize that, they have to sell parts and things at the actual hobby shop. So having this extra income won't necessarily make you insensitive to value. You're still going to be value conscious, but you might be less disinclined to purchase something directly from the shop, because generally speaking, buying tires and parts and things from the shop is going to cost more money than if you went online and, got coupon codes and all that stuff. So it would help the shop stay in business, which helps the track stay open. It may also encourage different types of racing surfaces. So one of the recent trends in modern RC racing is to race on AstroTurf, and there are economic reasons to do so, because on conventional off-road dirt racing, which is what these cars were made for, they were made for off-road racing on dirt. You have to spend a lot of time preparing the track surface to build a nice dirt track. You have to bring in equipment to build the track. You have to, stomp it all down after you build all your jumps and your features, and then you have to let the dirt settle. You don't just run on it right away because you'll destroy the track. So it takes a couple of weeks to actually build a dirt track and be able to use it without destroying it. So if the shop owner is also collecting universal basic income because they're also a citizen, then that can help the shop weather periods of time where they're not monetizing the track. Because if you can't run on the track because the dirt's drying out literally, then you can't have people pay you for practice hours or pay you to race on the track. So the track's losing money even more when you're not using it. And that's a big problem with dirt tracks, and they can only make up for that by having a whole lot of people race at that track when they actually do race. But the problem is some tracks don't have that large of an audience, and so the more economically feasible thing to do instead of running on dirt is they'll basically make the entire track out of AstroTurf. And with AstroTurf, it's a lot easier to build a track. It's easier to build track features, like you can build a jump out of wood, slap some AstroTurf on that, and if you could just move that jump around physically to some other part of the track if you want to change the layout. So what that means is with AstroTurf, to change the track layout, it doesn't take weeks. It takes like a couple of hours, and then you have a whole new track. So it's very convenient, and it's really good for the shop owners. But I know several shop owners who, even though they have to go to AstroTurf for business reasons, at their heart and soul, they prefer to race on dirt. Okay? So you may see, it might not be definitive, but certainly something like a UBI could help some of the track owners stay on dirt and not move to AstroTurf for economic reasons. So that could be good, especially for someone like me who prefers racing on dirt. You might even see more vintage racing. So, again, these two cars are vintage cars. Most of my collection is actually a vintage collection. Everything you see here on the top shelf, those are all vintage cars. Everything except these two, these are all vintage cars. These are all vintage cars. That's vintage, those are modern. Everything over here, vintage, those are modern. Mostly vintage cars. I really love vintage racing. I still have all these projects over here of different vintage cars that I'm building and restoring and working on. And I spend a lot of time and frankly money doing vintage builds. and when I have a chance to, I like to race them. But vintage stuff is not cheap because they don't make those cars anymore. They stopped making them in the 1990s, so that it's hard to get parts. It's hard to even find the cars in the first place. So vintage racing is a totally different scene compared to modern racing. You can sort of compare it to, like with full-scale racing, it's a difference between racing like an old Ferrari from the 1960s and a brand new Ferrari, right? The brand new Ferrari you can get parts for, the old one you can't. And so the old ones are more expensive as a result. But if people have a bit more money, disposable income, in their pocket, and they really love racing, they can afford to start exploring vintage racing if that's something they want to try out. So there are a lot of interesting dynamics that I think a UBI would have as far as its impact on the RC community and the RC industry more broadly. So I'm rather hopeful for this personally. If you're interested in learning more about universal basic income, there are plenty of sources you can go to. And one place to go to if you're interested in the actual the presidential candidate who's proposing this for the 2020 election. His name is Andrew Yang. You can go to yang2020.com. He has, all of the policies, over 100 policies on his website. He has a big section devoted to universal basic income, the entire breakdown of exactly how he plans to pay for this, how much comes from value-added tax, how much comes from cost savings downstream and keeping people out of prisons and all this wonderful stuff. So it's very interesting. So again, I don't want to get political here. This is more about the projected impact from, in my view, of UBI on the RC industry. But if you want to learn more about it, I highly recommend checking out his website. He's done interviews with people from all sides of the political spectrum. He's interviewed with conservative people like Ben Shapiro. He's interviewed with people who are more libertarian or liberal like Joe Rogan. Both were very long interviews. They were very cordial, very informative. So, yeah, go check it out. And thanks for watching.